A humanitarian aid shipment from Mexico arrived in Cuba on Monday as the island continues to battle a worsening economic and energy crisis. The Panama-flagged vessel Asian Katra entered Havana Bay carrying food supplies and hygiene products, becoming the fifth humanitarian aid ship sent by Mexico since February. The delivery comes amid mounting pressure on Cuba following tightened United States sanctions and disruptions to oil supplies that have contributed to prolonged blackouts and shortages across the country. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has maintained humanitarian support for Cuba while navigating diplomatic tensions with Washington. Residents gathered along the Havana waterfront early in the morning as the cargo ship slowly approached the harbor. Fishing boats moved across the bay while families, workers, and children watched the vessel arrive, carrying desperately needed supplies. Cuban and Mexican flags waved from the dock as officials from both countries prepared to welcome the shipment. The latest aid delivery reflects the growing concern across Latin America over Cuba's deepening hardships. The country has experienced severe shortages of fuel, food, and basic consumer goods in recent months. Long electricity outages have affected daily life throughout the island, while inflation and supply disruptions continue to place heavy pressure on ordinary citizens. People standing near the harbor described the difficult conditions many Cubans are currently facing. One local farmer explained how the shortages and blackouts have changed daily routines for families and workers alike. Mario Oliver, a Cuban farmer who came to observe the arrival of the ship, spoke about the humanitarian importance of the aid being delivered to the island. Yes, it has value, humanitarian value, and it helps the people who are really struggling with the blackouts and everything. The blackouts are quite long, and there's nothing either. Everything is very expensive, so at least this is some kind of help, he said. Across Havana, residents have spent months dealing with unstable electricity supplies and rising prices for food and household products. Many shops remain poorly stocked, forcing families to depend on informal markets or external support from relatives abroad. The arrival of humanitarian shipments has therefore become a significant event for many communities struggling through the crisis. The vessel Asian Katra carried a cargo that included food supplies and personal hygiene products intended to assist vulnerable groups across the country. Mexican officials said the shipment was organized as part of an emergency humanitarian response coordinated by the Mexican government. Mexico's ambassador to Cuba, Miguel Ignacio Diaz-Reynoso, attended the ceremony at the dock alongside Cuban government officials and diplomats from other Latin American countries. He explained that the shipment was part of Mexico's broader effort to provide rapid humanitarian assistance to Cuba during the ongoing emergency. Miguel Ignacio Diaz-Reynoso, Mexico's ambassador to Cuba, said the aid package was designed to deliver immediate relief to Cuban citizens facing shortages. The Mexican president's intention has been to provide rapid assistance, aid to support with food, some personal hygiene items, and that is basically the content of the aid from the Mexican government, he said. Mexico has emerged as one of Cuba's most active regional supporters during the crisis. President Claudia Sheinbaum's administration has repeatedly emphasized humanitarian cooperation with Havana despite growing geopolitical tensions in the region. Earlier this year, Mexico also sent naval ships carrying hundreds of tons of supplies to Cuba after the island's fuel shortages intensified. The humanitarian shipments have become increasingly important following disruptions to Cuba's traditional oil supply network. Washington expanded pressure on countries supplying fuel to Havana after Renset wed tensions involving Venezuela and Cuba earlier this year. The resulting energy shortages have led to widespread blackouts across the island, affecting transportation, businesses, schools, and hospitals. At the dock in Havana, senior Cuban officials greeted the arriving delegation as the ship completed unloading procedures. Cuban Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Trade and Investment Oscar Perez Fraga attended the welcoming ceremony together with officials from the Ministry of Food Industry and foreign diplomats. Cuban Food Industry Minister Alberto Lopez described the aid as a symbol of regional solidarity during one of the most difficult periods Cuba has experienced in recent years. He praised the support provided by Mexico, Uruguay, and other Latin American nations. Alberto Lopez, Cuba's Minister of Food Industry, expressed gratitude for the assistance during remarks delivered at the harbor ceremony. "We are eternally grateful for this gesture of solidarity from the people of Mexico, Uruguay, and Cuba. I believe that moments like this, when we receive aid from these nations, also demonstrate the unity of the Cuban people with the rest of the world and the Cuban people's gratitude to Latin America for being there in these times, showing that Cuba is not alone, he said. The shipment arrives at a time when Cuba's economy remains under extraordinary strain. The island has struggled with reduced fuel imports, falling tourism revenues, inflation, and infrastructure challenges that have worsened living conditions for millions of people. In many regions, electricity outages have lasted for several hours each day, disrupting food storage, communications, and industrial activity. International analysts say Cuba's energy crisis intensified after interruptions to oil shipments from Venezuela and increased pressure from the United States on countries continuing energy cooperation with Havana. The administration of U.S. President Donald Trump has threatened add tariffs and other measures targeting nations that provide oil or economic assistance to Cuba, arguing that the Cuban government poses security concerns for Washington. Cuba has rejected those accusations. Mexico's government has attempted to balance diplomatic relations with the United States while maintaining humanitarian and political ties with Cuba. President Claudia Sheinbaum has publicly defended the decision to continue sending humanitarian support, describing it as a matter of regional solidarity and humanitarian responsibility. Although previous shipments from Mexico included large quantities of aid transported aboard Navy vessels, officials said the latest delivery was focused primarily on essential consumer supplies needed by Cuban families. Food products, hygiene materials, and basic necessities remain in high demand across the island. The atmosphere along Havana Bay reflected both relief and uncertainty. Residents gathered near the waterfront watched as cranes and workers prepared to unload the cargo from the ship. Some took photographs while others simply observed quietly from the shoreline. For many Cubans, the arrival of humanitarian assistance has become one of the few visible signs of international support during a period marked by economic hardship and political tension. The blackouts mentioned by residents have become a central issue in everyday life, with neighborhoods often experiencing long interruptions in power supply during peak evening hours. Cuba's government has continued to call for greater international cooperation and relief from economic sanctions. Officials argue that the U.S. embargo and additional restrictions have severely limited the country's ability to import fuel, medicines, and food products. Washington, meanwhile, maintains that its policies are aimed at pressuring the Cuban government politically. The humanitarian aid operation also highlighted the continued diplomatic relationship between Mexico and Cuba, a partnership that has historically remained strong despite changing political conditions across the Americas. Mexican leaders from different administrations have traditionally maintained communication and cooperation with Havana, even during periods of regional tension. Under President Claudia Sheinbaum, Mexico has continued that approach while also trying to avoid direct confrontation with Washington. Analysts say the humanitarian shipments reflect both humanitarian priorities and broader political symbolism within Latin America. The presence of diplomats from multiple countries during the arrival ceremony reinforced the regional dimension of the aid mission. Officials from Uruguay and Cuba joined Mexican representatives at the port to receive the shipment and oversee its arrival procedures. The ship itself, the Asian Katra, sailed under a Panama flag and entered Havana Bay during daylight hours before docking near the harbor facilities. Television cameras and photographers documented the arrival as local residents gathered nearby. For Cuban families facing shortages of food and household products, the shipment represents temporary relief amid continuing uncertainty about the country's economic future. Many citizens remain concerned about inflation, fuel shortages, and the possibility of additional blackouts in the coming months. Despite the challenges, Cuban officials emphasized themes of solidarity and resilience throughout the welcoming ceremony. Speakers repeatedly referred to regional cooperation and Latin American unity while thanking neighboring countries for their assistance. Mexico has indicated that additional humanitarian support could continue if conditions in Cuba worsen further. Earlier this year, President Claudia Sheinbaum also stated that her administration was exploring diplomatic solutions that could allow Mexico to resume broader forms of support for the island without triggering punitive measures from Washington. The humanitarian situation in Cuba remains closely watched across the region. International organizations and regional governments have expressed concern about shortages affecting healthcare, electricity generation, and access to basic consumer goods. As unloading operations continued at the Havana dock, Officials prepared to distribute the supplies through government channels to communities most affected by shortages and power outages. Cuban authorities said priority would be given to vulnerable groups, including children, older citizens, and families facing the greatest economic difficulties. The arrival of the Asian Katra ultimately became more than a routine cargo delivery. For many residents standing along Havana Bay, it represented a rare moment of international support during an exceptionally difficult chapter for the country.